The impossible siege that cracked open the east. Picture this: the sun rises blood-red over the ancient walls of Nicaea, capital of the Seljuk Turkish Sultanate, jewel of Anatolia, fortress city that has never fallen to Christian arms. The year is 1097 AD, and massed before these towering stone ramparts sits the most unlikely army ever assembled on Asian soil, 30,000 European warriors who have marched 2,000 miles through hostile territory, united only by faith and a pope's promise of salvation. They are exhausted, diseased, low on supplies, and impossibly outnumbered. Inside the city walls, a garrison of 40,000 elite Turkish warriors prepares for battle, secure in the knowledge that Sultan Kilij Arslan commands an additional 210,000 mounted archers racing toward them across the Anatolian plains. The mathematics of this confrontation defy logic. 30,000 Christians, mostly infantry, facing a combined force of 250,000 Muslim cavalry and defenders. The odds, 8-1. The terrain, hostile. The supply lines, non-existent. The chances of survival, historians at the time gave them none. Yet what happened at Nicaea over 47 days of siege, starvation, and slaughter would shatter the invincibility of Turkish power in Anatolia, open the road to Jerusalem, and demonstrate that impossible odds mean nothing when leadership, faith, and tactical genius converge in a single desperate moment. This is the story of the siege that shocked two civilizations and the ruthless brilliance that made it possible. The strategic chessboard, why Nicaea was the key to everything. To understand why 30,000 Crusaders were willing to risk annihilation at Nicaea, you need to grasp the geopolitical earthquake that preceded them. 22 years earlier, in 1075 AD, the Seljuk Turks had crushed the Byzantine Empire at the Battle of Manzikert, capturing the Byzantine emperor himself and opening all of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, to Turkish conquest. In a single generation, 1,000 years of Christian civilization in Asia Minor was swept away by a tidal wave of nomadic horse archers whose composite bows could pierce armor at 300 yards. By 1096, when Pope Urban II launched the First Crusade at the Council of Clermont, the Byzantine Empire, what remained of the once mighty Eastern Roman Empire, was hemorrhaging territory, wealth, and credibility. The emperor in Constantinople, Alexios I Komnenos, had sent desperate letters to Rome begging for mercenaries, for soldiers, for anything that could stop the Turkish advance before Constantinople itself fell. What he got instead was something far more dangerous and unpredictable: a holy war. The crusade that assembled in Constantinople in the spring of 1097 was not an army in any traditional sense. It was a coalition of feuding European noblemen, each commanding his own contingent, each jealous of his own glory, each suspicious of his neighbors. There was Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, pious and methodical; Raymond IV of Toulouse, wealthy and ambitious, commanding the largest single force; Bohemond of Taranto, a Norman adventurer whose father had spent years trying to conquer Byzantine territory, making him the least trustworthy ally Alexios could imagine; and dozens of lesser lords, each with their own banners, languages, and agendas. But Nicaea was non-negotiable. Located just 60 miles southeast of Constantinople, this ancient city, where the Christian Nicene Creed had been formulated in 325 AD, was the capital of Seljuk power in Anatolia, the headquarters of Sultan Kilij Arslan's empire. Its walls stretched 3 miles in circumference, studded with hundreds of towers, protected by a massive lake on its western side. It was the linchpin of Turkish control. Take Nicaea, and the road to Jerusalem opened. Fail at Nicaea, and the crusade died before it truly began. Emperor Alexios knew this, the Crusader lords knew this, and most importantly, Sultan Kilij Arslan knew this. The Turkish advantage, when numbers tell only half the story. Let's talk about what the Crusaders were facing, because the numbers alone don't capture the true horror of their situation. The 40,000 Turkish defenders inside Nicaea weren't garrison troops manning walls. These were Ghazis, holy warriors who had spent their entire lives fighting Byzantine, Arab, and fellow Turkish armies. They were equipped with the finest composite bows in the medieval world, weapons that required decades to master, constructed from wood, horn, and sinew, capable of raining arrows on attackers from behind stone battlements with devastating accuracy. The walls themselves rose 30 feet high in places, reinforced with Roman engineering that had withstood 800 years of warfare. But here's what historians often gloss over. The real threat wasn't inside the city, it was coming across the plains. Sultan Kilij Arslan had been campaigning in eastern Anatolia when he received word that a massive Christian army had appeared before his capital. His initial response was contempt. 20 years of defeating Byzantine armies had taught him that Europeans were slow, predictable, and terrified of Turkish cavalry. He had crushed two earlier waves of Crusaders, the disorganized People's Crusade, with barely any effort, literally slaughtering thousands of peasant pilgrims outside Nicaea just months before. From his perspective, this was simply another opportunity to demonstrate Turkish supremacy. So he assembled every available warrior from across his sultanate, 210,000 mounted archers, lancers, and sword-wielding Ghazis. This wasn't just an army, it was a migration of violence, a thundering mass of horses and steel that could cover 50 miles in a day, that fought using hit-and-run tactics perfected over centuries on the Central Asian steppes. They didn't fight like Europeans, standing in ranks trading blows. They swarmed, retreated, feinted, showered enemies with arrows from horseback, then vanished before counterattacks could form. The Turkish military system was essentially designed to destroy exactly the kind of heavy infantry and night-based armies that comprised the Crusader force. History had proven this again and again. The Turks had devastated Arab armies, Persian armies, and Byzantine armies using these exact tactics. There was no reason to believe a collection of European adventurers would fare any better. Sultan Kilij Arslan's strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Let the Christians exhaust themselves besieging Nicaea's impregnable walls. Let them starve in the Anatolian summer heat, watching their horses die and their supplies dwindle. Then, when they were at their weakest, arrive with overwhelming force and annihilate them against the very walls they were trying to breach. Catch them between the garrison inside and the army outside. Leave no survivors. Send a message that would echo across Europe. Stay in your cold, northern forests or die in the eastern sun. It should have worked. Leadership under fire, the war council that changed everything. May 14, 1097 AD. The Crusader army completes its march from Constantinople and establishes camp around Nicaea's eastern and southern walls. The western wall, protected by Lake Ascanius, remains open, a glaring weakness that allows the Turkish garrison to receive supplies by boat and potentially escape if needed. The Crusader lords gather in Godfrey of Bouillon's command tent for a war council that will determine whether this entire enterprise is glorious martyrdom or strategic catastrophe. The debate is fierce. Raymond of Toulouse argues for an immediate assault, throw everything at the walls before the Sultan's army arrives, accept heavy casualties, but take the city through sheer European aggression. His reasoning is sound. The longer they wait, the more time Sultan Kilij Arslan has to arrive with his overwhelming numbers. Strike now, strike hard, worry about losses later. Bohemond of Taranto counters with brutal pragmatism. The walls are too strong, he argues. Turkish defenders are too skilled with their bows. A direct assault without siege equipment, without proper scaling ladders, without mining operations, would simply pile Christian corpses against stone with nothing to show for it. He's seen Turkish defenses before during his campaigns in Byzantine territory. Rushing those walls is suicide. Robert of Flanders introduces another problem: supplies. The army has been on the march for months. Food is running low. The surrounding countryside has been stripped bare by previous Turkish campaigns. Summer heat is intensifying. Men are already suffering from dysentery and heat exhaustion. A prolonged siege might kill more Crusaders than Turkish arrows. Then there's the Byzantine factor. Emperor Alexios has promised siege equipment, supplies, and most crucially, Byzantine naval forces to blockade the lake and prevent Turkish resupply. But where are they? The emperor had been helpful, even generous, when the Crusaders were in Constantinople. Now, with his forces needed on the battlefield, there are delays, excuses, complications. Some of the Crusader lords, particularly Bohemond, who has fought against Byzantines before, openly question whether Alexios wants them to succeed or simply wants them to weaken themselves fighting Turks. The atmosphere in that command tent is poisonous with mistrust. These aren't unified forces under a single commander. These are rival noblemen who speak different languages, follow different military traditions, and harbor deep suspicions about each other's motives. The only thing holding them together is the Pope's blessing and the promise that whoever leads the charge to Jerusalem gains eternal glory. It's Godfrey of Bouillon, often overshadowed in histories by more flamboyant personalities, who proposes the strategy that will define the siege. Methodical, patient, and deeply pious, Godfrey argues for a disciplined approach: construct proper siege engines, mine the walls, maintain tight discipline, and above all, prepare for Sultan Kilij Arslan's relief army. Don't exhaust the troops in futile assaults. Build strength. Force the Turks to come to them. But here's the genius that historians often miss. Godfrey also insists on something unprecedented for medieval warfare: unified command structure during battle even while maintaining the political independence of each contingent. When the Sultan's army arrives, there can be no confusion, no competing orders, no glorious but suicidal individual charges. The Crusaders' only advantage is their heavy cavalry and disciplined infantry. Waste that advantage through chaos, and they all die. Not everyone agrees. The younger knights are hungry for glory, for immediate action, for the kind of heroic charges that troubadours sing about in European courts. But the senior commanders, men who have survived decades of warfare, recognize wisdom when they hear it. The vote is taken. The decision is made. Nicaea will be besieged properly, methodically, and when the Sultan comes, they will be ready. They hope. The mathematics of siege warfare, engineering against impossible odds. What follows over the next 2 weeks is one of the great engineering achievements of medieval warfare, accomplished under conditions that would break modern armies. The Crusaders begin construction of siege towers, massive wooden structures that can be rolled up to the walls, allowing attackers to fight defenders at equal height. But there's a problem: there are almost no trees near Nicaea. The Turks have cleared the surrounding area for exactly this reason. So work parties, guarded by knights in full armor under the blazing Anatolian sun, must venture miles to find timber, cut it, and drag it back to camp. Turkish cavalry from inside the city make constant sorties, attacking these work parties, killing laborers, burning supplies. Simultaneously, mining operations begin. Medieval siege mining is brutal, claustrophobic work. Sappers dig tunnels under the walls, shore them up with wooden supports, then set fire to the supports, causing sections of wall to collapse. The Turks, experienced in siege defense, begin countermining, digging their own tunnels to intercept the Crusader mines, leading to savage underground battles fought in darkness with knives and short swords, where dozens of men kill each other in spaces where you can't stand upright. The Crusaders also construct mangonels and trebuchets, medieval artillery that hurls stones weighing up to 300 pounds against the walls. These machines require precise engineering, seasoned wood, and complex rope systems. Every piece must be crafted by hand. When they finally begin operation, bombarding sections of wall day and night, the psychological impact is enormous. The Turkish defenders have never faced sustained artillery on this scale. The constant thunder of impact, the vibration shaking the very stones, wears down morale in ways that direct assault cannot. But the biggest problem remains that open western wall protected by the lake. Turkish boats continue to bring supplies, reinforcements, and most importantly, intelligence about the Crusader dispositions directly to the garrison. Until that supply line is cut, Nicaea can hold indefinitely. Emperor Alexios finally delivers on his promise on June 17th, nearly a month into the siege. Byzantine ships appear on the Marmara Sea coast, are disassembled, transporting overland on ox carts to Lake Ascanius, and reassembled on the shore. It's an engineering feat that rivals anything the Crusaders have accomplished. Within 2 days, a Byzantine fleet commanded by Admiral Bouillon is patrolling the lake, cutting off Turkish resupply and bombarding the western walls with ship-mounted artillery. The noose is tightening. But everyone knows what's coming. Sultan Kilij Arslan is approaching with his massive army, and the Crusaders are about to face the test that will determine whether faith and discipline can overcome impossible numbers. The storm breaks when 250,000 warriors descend. May 21st, 1097 AD, just 7 days into the siege. The first encounter comes far sooner than anyone expected. A massive dust cloud appears to the east, the unmistakable sign of a major cavalry force approaching at speed. Sultan Kilij Arslan, informed of the siege by Turkish scouts and furious at the audacity of these European invaders, has force-marched his army across Anatolia faster than anyone thought possible. He hasn't brought his full 210,000 warriors. Logistics make that impossible, but he's brought enough. Approximately 70,000 mounted warriors, predominantly archers, with a core of heavy cavalry for shock charges. The mathematics still favor the Turks overwhelmingly. 70,000 experienced cavalry against 30,000 Crusaders, many of whom are tied down maintaining siege operations, guarding camps, operating siege engines. If the Sultan can catch them disorganized, divided between siege operations and defensive formations, he can destroy them piecemeal. But Godfrey's insistence on preparation proves its worth immediately. Crusader scouts have been patrolling aggressively, providing early warning. Rather than being caught scattered, the Crusaders have time, barely, to form defensive positions. The siege engines continue operating, keeping pressure on the city, but the bulk of the fighting forces establish defensive lines facing east, anchored on rough terrain that limits Turkish cavalry mobility. The Turkish attack begins at dawn with the sun at their backs, blinding the Crusaders. Waves of horse archers sweep forward, unleashing storms of arrows from composite bows at ranges where Crusader crossbows cannot effectively respond. The air darkens with shafts. Men fall screaming, arrows punching through mail, finding gaps in armor, creating a steady hemorrhage of casualties. The Turks don't close for melee combat. They don't need to. They simply circle, shoot, withdraw, circle again, a tactical ballet perfected over centuries. This is the moment when European knights traditionally break discipline, when individual glory-seeking overwhelms tactical sense, when heavy cavalry charges forward seeking glorious combat and rides straight into ambush and annihilation. It's how the Turks destroyed the Byzantine Empire. It's how they've won every major battle against European forces for 2 decades. But the Crusader lines hold. Raymond of Toulouse's Provençal forces on the southern flank absorb horrific punishment but maintain formation. Robert of Normandy's knights, dismounted and fighting as heavy infantry behind shields, create a wall of steel that Turkish arrows cannot penetrate. Bohemond of Taranto, the most experienced commander in the army, personally leads the northern defensive position, his Normans using the terrain to negate Turkish mobility advantages. The battle rages for 6 hours, 6 brutal hours of arrows, screams, heat, and death. The Turks probe for weaknesses, finding none. They attempt to flank, but Crusader cavalry reserves shift to block each movement. They feign retreat, trying to draw Christians into pursuit, but discipline holds. The Crusaders have learned from Byzantine defeats. They're not fighting like Europeans anymore, they're fighting like an army that understands its enemy. As afternoon arrives and neither side has broken, Sultan Kilij Arslan makes his critical error. Frustrated by the stubborn defense, convinced that one massive charge will shatter these exhausted Christians, he commits his heavy cavalry, his elite shock troops, in a massed assault against the Crusader center. It's exactly what Godfrey has been waiting for. The critical moment when iron meets faith. Here's what historians often miss about medieval heavy cavalry. When properly employed, when charging in disciplined formation against infantry or light cavalry, they are the medieval equivalent of tanks. A knight in full armor weighs 300 pounds. His horse weighs another 1,000 pounds. Charging at full gallop, that's 1,300 pounds of steel, muscle, and momentum moving at 30 miles per hour. Now multiply that by 2,000 knights charging in formation, lance points leveled, and you have a force that can shatter almost any defensive line in existence. The Turks have rarely faced this kind of charge. Their military culture is built around mobility, archery, and avoiding direct combat. When the Sultan's heavy cavalry commits to their assault on the Crusader center, Godfrey unleashes his own heavy cavalry in a countercharge from the flanks, a double envelopment that catches Turkish forces in a devastating pincer. The collision is cataclysmic. Lances punch through Turkish armor. Warhorses bred specifically for combat trample lighter Turkish mounts. The weight, the momentum, the sheer kinetic energy of the Crusader charge creates a shock wave that ripples through Turkish formations. In medieval warfare, cavalry charges either break immediately or succeed immediately. There's rarely a middle ground. The psychological impact of seeing massive armored knights thundering toward you, of watching your comrades vanish beneath steel and hooves, of realizing you cannot shoot fast enough to stop them, creates panic faster than actual casualties. The Turkish heavy cavalry breaks. They wheel away, trying to disengage, and in doing so expose their flanks to continued Crusader pursuit. What should have been a controlled withdrawal becomes a rout as panic spreads through Turkish ranks. The light cavalry, seeing their elite forces fleeing, lose cohesion. The entire 70,000-strong Turkish army begins streaming away from the battlefield, harried by Crusader cavalry that pursues for miles, cutting down stragglers, capturing baggage trains, turning defeat into disaster. Sultan Kilij Arslan escapes with perhaps 40,000 warriors intact, but he's lost nearly 30,000 men killed, wounded, or captured in a single afternoon. More importantly, he's lost something irreplaceable: the aura of invincibility. For 22 years, Turkish armies have defeated Christian forces through superior mobility and tactics. In one battle, the Crusaders have demonstrated that discipline, heavy cavalry, and proper defensive tactics can neutralize Turkish advantages and inflict devastating losses. The Sultan retreats east, nursing his wounds, making excuses, and trying to assemble reinforcements. He will return, but the Siege of Nicaea now continues without threat of immediate relief. Inside the city walls, the garrison realizes they are truly alone, facing an enemy that has just defeated the Sultan's field army. The mathematics of the siege shift dramatically. Morale inside, the city begins to crack. The siege tightens when walls become tombs. With the Turkish relief army scattered, the Crusaders intensify their assault on Nicaea with renewed confidence. The siege engines thunder day and night. Mining operations collapse two major sections of wall, creating breaches that should allow assault. But the Turkish garrison, fighting now with the desperation of men who know no relief is coming, launches savage counterattacks that throw back every attempt to exploit the breaches. One assault led by Raymond of Toulouse's forces nearly succeeds, pushing into the city through a collapsed section of wall, only to be caught in a carefully prepared kill zone where Turkish archers rain arrows from surrounding buildings while defending infantry attack from multiple directions. Raymond himself is nearly captured. His forces retreat carrying hundreds of wounded, having gained nothing but casualties. The lesson is brutal. Even with breaches in the walls, taking a fortified city defended by 40,000 experienced warriors requires a level of attrition that could cripple the crusade. Every man lost at Nicaea is one less warrior to march to Jerusalem. The Crusader lords begin discussing terms, perhaps negotiate a surrender, accept Turkish withdrawal from the city in exchange for lives, move on to the ultimate objective. This siege is becoming too expensive. But Emperor Alexios has other plans, and this is where Byzantine politics becomes as important as medieval warfare. The emperor's representative, Bouillon, has been negotiating secretly with the Turkish garrison using the Byzantine fleet as intermediary. The offer is simple: surrender not to the Crusaders, but to the Byzantine Empire. In exchange, lives will be spared, property protected, safe passage guaranteed. The Byzantines will occupy Nicaea, return it to imperial control, and the Crusaders can continue their march to Jerusalem without the blood cost of taking the city by storm. From the Byzantine perspective, this is perfect. They regain their ancient capital without losing men. They prevent the Crusaders from sacking the city and claiming it as their own territory, and they demonstrate to everyone that the real power in this region remains Constantinople, not these European adventurers. From the Crusader perspective, it's a betrayal. They've spent 6 weeks besieging this city, lost thousands of men, exhausted their supplies and patience, and now the Byzantines are stealing their victory through diplomacy. The outrage among Crusader ranks is volcanic. Bohemond of Taranto, already suspicious of Byzantine intentions, explodes with fury. The ordinary soldiers, promised plunder from Nicaea's wealthy treasuries, riot when they realize they'll get nothing. But the senior Crusader lords, Godfrey, Raymond, Robert, recognize reality. They need Byzantine supplies, Byzantine guides, Byzantine intelligence to survive the march through Anatolia. Starting a war with Emperor Alexios over who gets credit for taking Nicaea is suicidal. So they swallow their pride, accept Byzantine gifts of gold and silk as compensation, and agree to the arrangement. On June 19, 1097 AD, Turkish commanders inside Nicaea accept Byzantine terms. That night, under cover of darkness, Byzantine troops are ferried across Lake Ascanius and enter the city through the western gates. By dawn on June 20th, Byzantine banners fly from Nicaea's towers. The siege is over, not through assault, not through starvation, but through political theater that leaves everyone, Crusaders, Turks, and Byzantines, feeling cheated and suspicious. But the strategic objective is achieved. The gateway to Anatolia is open, the road to Jerusalem beckons, and the crusade, against all odds, has survived its first major test. The butcher's bill, counting the cost of victory. Let's examine the mathematics of what occurred at Nicaea, because the numbers reveal why this siege became legendary. Crusader casualties during the 6-week siege and the major battle, approximately 4,500 killed, another 6,000 wounded. These are devastating losses, nearly 1/3 of the army killed or combat ineffective. In modern military terms, this level of attrition would be considered catastrophic, requiring complete unit reconstitution. But by medieval standards, particularly given what was accomplished, these losses were acceptable. Turkish casualties are harder to determine precisely, but contemporary sources, both Christian and Muslim, suggest approximately 32,000 warriors killed during the relief attempt and the siege operations, with another 15,000 wounded or captured. The garrison inside Nicaea, approximately 40,000 strong, surrendered intact under Byzantine terms, which means they weren't casualties but were removed from Sultan Kilij Arslan's military capacity for months. The wealth captured or recovered was staggering. Nicaea was the capital of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, home to 20 years of accumulated treasure from raids, taxes, and trade. The Byzantine Empire secured control of mint-grade gold, silk stockpiles, weapons arsenals, and most importantly, the psychological victory of reclaiming a city where Christianity's most fundamental doctrines had been codified 8 centuries earlier. But here's what the raw numbers don't capture: the strategic reversal that occurred in Anatolia. Before Nicaea, Turkish control of Asia Minor seemed permanent, an irreversible historical shift. The Seljuk Turks had crushed every Byzantine counter-offensive for 2 decades. The idea that European armies could march across Anatolia, besiege major fortified cities, and defeat Turkish field armies in open battle would have seemed fantasy. After Nicaea, that fantasy became reality. The psychological impact reverberated across 2 civilizations. In Europe, word of the victory triggered a new wave of Crusader recruitment. Nicaea proved that Jerusalem was achievable, that Turkish military supremacy could be challenged, that God truly favored the Christian cause. In the Islamic world, the shock was profound. How had these European barbarians, these slow-moving heavy infantry forces, defeated Turkish cavalry? What did it mean for the future of jihad against the Byzantine Empire? Where was the guaranteed victory that Muslim commanders had relied upon for a generation? Sultan Kilij Arslan withdrew to rebuild his forces, but his reputation was damaged irreparably. Other Turkish commanders began questioning his leadership. The political unity of the Seljuk Sultanate, never strong, began fragmenting as different beys, regional commanders, calculated their own alliances and strategies. The Crusaders had driven a wedge into the Turkish power structure simply by winning when everyone expected them to lose. The march to destiny, how Nicaea changed everything that followed. The fall of Nicaea in June 1097 set in motion a chain of military campaigns that would reshape the medieval world. Let's trace how this single siege influenced everything that came after. Immediately following Nicaea, the Crusader army marched southeast into the Anatolian interior, facing Sultan Kilij Arslan again at the Battle of Dorylaeum just 12 days later. This time the Sultan brought his full force, estimated at nearly 200,000 warriors, in a massive ambush designed to annihilate the Christians in open terrain where Turkish cavalry advantages would be overwhelming. The battle lasted 2 days, and once again, Crusader discipline and heavy cavalry proved decisive. The Turkish army was shattered so completely that Sultan Kilij Arslan abandoned his capital, withdrew to Persia, and essentially ceded Anatolia to Byzantine reconquest. Think about that progression. The victory at Nicaea created the confidence, tactical doctrine, and momentum that enabled victory at Dorylaeum. That second victory opened the entire interior of Anatolia to Crusader advance. For the next 3 months, the Crusaders marched through territory that had been Turkish-controlled for 20 years, meeting minimal resistance because Turkish military power had been broken in 2 catastrophic defeats. By October 1097, the Crusaders reached Syria and began the Siege of Antioch, another impossible siege that they would somehow win. By June 1099, they stood before the walls of Jerusalem itself. The entire strategic corridor from Constantinople to the Holy Land had been reopened in just 2 years, a military accomplishment that would have seemed delusional before Nicaea. But here's the deeper consequence that historians debate. Did Nicaea make the Crusaders too confident? Did their early victories against Turkish forces create a dangerous overconfidence that would lead to catastrophic defeats in later decades? The answer is complex. The First Crusade succeeded in large part because the Crusaders learned to respect their enemies, adapted their tactics, and fought with disciplined caution. Later Crusades often failed because European commanders, hearing stories of Turkish defeats, assumed easy victory and charged headlong into disaster. Nicaea taught the generation of 1097 that impossible odds could be overcome through unity, discipline, and tactical innovation. But it couldn't teach their sons and grandsons who had never faced Turkish arrows in the Anatolian heat, who knew only the stories of glory and triumph, who assumed that faith alone guaranteed victory. The lesson of Nicaea, that superior tactics and discipline, not just courage, determined outcomes, was partially forgotten, leading to defeats at Hattin, Harran, and elsewhere in the following centuries. The tactical revolution, what Nicaea revealed about medieval warfare. Military historians consider the Siege of Nicaea and the Battle of Dorylaeum that followed as pivotal moments in the evolution of medieval warfare. Here's why. For centuries, European military doctrine had been dominated by individual warrior prowess, the knight as ultimate weapon, seeking single combat and glory, with battles often devolving into thousands of individual duels rather than coordinated tactical operations. The Crusaders at Nicaea demonstrated that medieval armies could operate with Roman-level discipline when survival demanded it. The defensive tactics used against Sultan Kilij Arslan's initial relief army, refusing to break formation, using terrain to limit enemy mobility, coordinating infantry and cavalry reserves, holding disciplined lines under sustained arrow fire, represented a level of tactical sophistication rarely seen in 11th century European warfare. These tactics were essentially Byzantine military doctrine, adapted to European heavy cavalry and infantry capabilities. Crusaders also demonstrated the effective use of combined arms warfare, siege engines providing sustained artillery fire while mining operations undermined walls, infantry holding defensive positions while heavy cavalry maintained mobile reserves, scouts and foragers operating aggressively to maintain intelligence and supply advantages. This wasn't just a mob of religious fanatics charging blindly at infidel walls. This was sophisticated military operations executed under extreme conditions. The Turkish defeat revealed vulnerabilities in the Central Asian mobile warfare doctrine that had dominated the Middle East for decades. Turkish horse archer tactics were devastating against disorganized enemies or forces that could be lured into ambushes, but against disciplined heavy infantry and cavalry that refused to break formation, that used terrain effectively, and that coordinated combined arms operations, Turkish advantages diminished significantly. The Seljuk Turks would adapt. Of course, military innovation is always a two-way process, but Nicaea proved they weren't invincible. Perhaps most importantly, Nicaea demonstrated the critical importance of logistics, siegecraft, and naval power in medieval campaigns. The Crusades succeeded not because European warriors were inherently superior to Turkish warriors, man for man, that's debatable, but because they secured Byzantine logistical support, employed superior siege engineering, and coordinated land and naval forces to create strategic advantages. These are lessons that modern militaries still teach. Tactics win battles, but logistics win wars. The leadership factor, why 30,000 defeated 250,000. Strip away the numbers, the tactics, the weapons, and you're left with a fundamental question. How did this happen? How did 30,000 Crusaders facing 250,000 Turkish warriors not just survive, but win decisively? The answer isn't divine intervention or European racial superiority, both popular explanations in medieval chronicles that serious historians reject. The answer is leadership, specifically the kind of leadership that emerges when survival demands impossible standards of excellence. Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, Bohemond of Taranto, Robert of Normandy, Robert of Flanders. These men were rivals, spoke different languages, represented different kingdoms, and under normal circumstances would never cooperate on anything. What united them at Nicaea wasn't friendship or shared culture. It was the cold mathematical realization that disunity meant death for everyone. So they did something extraordinary for medieval noblemen. They subordinated their egos to military necessity. Compare this to the Turkish leadership. Sultan Kilij Arslan was overconfident, underestimated his enemy, and force-marched his army expecting easy victory. When his initial relief attempt failed, rather than adapting his strategy, he simply tried the same tactics with more force. His subordinate commanders followed traditional Turkish military doctrine without innovation. There was no equivalent to the Crusader war councils where different perspectives were debated, where tactical adjustments were made based on observed enemy capabilities. This leadership differential explains more than any single factor why the Crusaders succeeded. They learned faster, adapted quicker, and maintained just enough unity to survive. Not perfect unity, the Crusaders would spend much of the next 2 years fighting among themselves over who controlled conquered territories, but enough unity when it mattered most. There's also the psychological element. The Crusaders had no retreat option. They were 2,000 miles from home, surrounded by hostile territory, supplied only through Byzantine goodwill that could evaporate at any moment. Defeat at Nicaea meant annihilation. That kind of existential pressure forges either panic or steel. The Crusader leadership chose steel, and their armies followed them into hell because the alternative was worse. Sultan Kilij Arslan could afford to lose battles. He could withdraw, rebuild, try again later. That strategic flexibility paradoxically made him weaker, because it meant he never faced the absolute necessity to win that sharpened Crusader decision-making to a razor's edge. The civilizational stakes, what hung in the balance? It's tempting to view the Siege of Nicaea as simply another medieval conflict, one more siege in an era filled with sieges, important perhaps for the Crusader narrative, but not genuinely world-changing. This would be a catastrophic misreading of history. If the Crusaders had been destroyed at Nicaea, which every reasonable military assessment suggested they would be, the entire trajectory of Mediterranean civilization shifts dramatically. The Byzantine Empire, deprived of Western military support, likely collapses within a generation as Turkish pressure continues unabated. Constantinople, the guardian of classical Greek and Roman knowledge, falls centuries earlier than it did historically. The Renaissance, which drew heavily on Byzantine scholars fleeing the Ottoman conquest, might never occur, or at least not in the form we know. The balance of power between Christian Europe and the Islamic world tilts decisively toward Islamic dominance. Without the Crusader kingdoms established in Syria and Palestine acting as a buffer, Turkish and Arab forces can focus entirely on conquering southeastern Europe. The entire Balkans perhaps even Italy and Spain, fall under Islamic control within a century. European civilization, confined to France, Germany, and England, develops along completely different trajectories. From the Islamic perspective, a Turkish victory at Nicaea would have confirmed divine favor, energized jihad movements across the Middle East, and potentially unified the fractured Islamic world against the common European threat. The Seljuk Sultanate might have achieved what later Ottoman Empire accomplished, dominance over the eastern Mediterranean, but 3 centuries earlier and with completely different religious and cultural implications. Even if you think the Crusades were ultimately a disaster, and there are excellent arguments for that position, the specific outcome at Nicaea was historically necessary for Europe to develop into the civilization that eventually dominated global affairs. Whether that's a good thing is a separate debate, but it's historically undeniable. The soldiers freezing and starving outside Nicaea's walls in June 1097 had no idea they were fighting for the future of Western civilization. They thought they were fighting for salvation, for glory, for revenge against the infidel. But history had placed them at a pivot point where individual courage and leadership could genuinely alter the course of human events. They rose to that challenge not because they understood its cosmic significance, but because they had no other choice. The timeless lessons, what Nicaea still teaches. 7 centuries separate us from the Siege of Nicaea, yet the lessons from those 47 days remain urgently relevant to anyone studying leadership, strategy, or the nature of seemingly impossible challenges. First lesson, impossible odds are only impossible if you accept them as such. The Crusaders faced mathematical annihilation, 8-to-1 odds, hostile terrain, no supply lines, surrounded by enemies. On paper, they should have been slaughtered, but they refused to accept the premise. They studied their enemy, adapted their tactics, exploited every advantage, and created opportunities through discipline and innovation. When modern leaders claim something is impossible, they're often really saying difficult or unprecedented. The difference is everything. Second lesson, unity of purpose can overcome diversity of background, but only under existential pressure. The Crusader lords had every reason to fight each other instead of cooperating. Different languages, different kingdoms, different personal ambitions. What united them was the recognition that disunity meant death. Modern organizations trying to foster teamwork without that existential pressure face a harder challenge. You can't manufacture the kind of focus that comes from knowing failure means annihilation. But you can create incentive structures that approximate it, where individual failure means collective failure, where success requires genuine cooperation rather than performative collaboration. Third lesson, tactical innovation requires first principles thinking, not precedent. Traditional European warfare said knights charge individually seeking glory. Traditional Turkish warfare said horse archers avoid direct combat. The Crusaders succeeded by ignoring European tradition and adapting Byzantine defensive tactics to their own capabilities. They asked, what does victory actually require, rather than what have we always done? That kind of first principles thinking is rare because it requires intellectual humility, admitting that your traditional methods might be inadequate to current challenges. Fourth lesson, strategic patience enables tactical aggression. The Crusaders didn't rush the siege. They built proper siege equipment, established defensive positions, prepared for the relief army. That patience created the foundation for aggressive tactical action when opportunities emerged. The countercharge that shattered Turkish cavalry, the mining operations that collapsed walls. Modern culture often celebrates urgent action over patient preparation, mistaking motion for progress. Nicaea demonstrates that proper preparation enables decisive action, while hasty action creates only casualties. Fifth lesson, leadership means subordinating ego to mission. Every Crusader lord wanted personal glory. Everyone believed he should command the entire army, yet they cooperated when survival demanded it. They held war councils, listened to each other, made collective decisions, and followed unified plans during battle. That's astonishingly rare behavior for medieval nobility or modern executives. The ego subordination wasn't permanent. They went back to fighting each other after Nicaea, but in the critical moment, mission preceded glory. That distinction determined success. Sixth lesson, your enemy's weaknesses are often mirror images of their strengths. Turkish mobile cavalry was devastating against disorganized enemies, but vulnerable to disciplined heavy infantry. The Crusaders didn't try to become better horse archers. They leveraged their own strengths, heavy cavalry, disciplined siege craft, against Turkish weaknesses, light cavalry ineffective in close combat, no experience with sustained artillery, overconfidence from previous victories. Competitive strategy isn't about being generally better than competitors. It's about matching your specific strengths against their specific weaknesses. Seventh lesson, momentum is psychological before it's physical. The Crusaders' victory at Nicaea created confidence that enabled victory at Dorylaeum, which created momentum that carried them to Jerusalem. But that momentum started with belief, the belief that European tactics could work, that discipline could overcome numbers, that the impossible might be achievable. Sultan Kilij Arslan's defeat created doubt that undermined Turkish effectiveness in subsequent battles. In warfare, business, or any competitive arena, the psychological effects of early wins or losses often exceed their tactical importance. The eternal echo, when history remembers the impossible. Stand today on the shores of Lake Iznik, modern name for Lake Ascanius, and look toward the ancient walls of Nicaea, now the Turkish town of Iznik, and you can still trace the outline of those Roman Byzantine fortifications. Tourists walk those walls, photographing the scenic views, mostly unaware that 9 centuries ago, 30,000 desperate men gambled everything against 250,000 enemies in a siege that shocked 2 civilizations. The physical evidence has faded. The Crusader camps are gone, the siege engines rotted away centuries ago, the mass grave unmarked and forgotten. But the echo of what occurred here reverberates still through our modern world in ways both obvious and subtle. Every military academy teaching the principles of combined arms warfare, of unified command, of adapting tactics to enemy weaknesses, teaches lessons first demonstrated at Nicaea. Every underdog confronting overwhelming odds and refusing to accept defeat as inevitable walks paths first carved by those Crusader lords who somehow forged unity from chaos. Every siege operation coordinating artillery, infantry, and special operations mirrors in modern form what medieval engineers and commanders improvised in the Anatolian summer of 1097. Perhaps the deepest lesson is this: history doesn't belong to the favorites, to those with superior numbers or resources or starting advantages. History belongs to those who refuse to accept that the mathematics of the moment determines the outcome of the future. 30,000 against 250,000 should mean annihilation, should mean a footnote about another failed crusade, another demonstration of Turkish military supremacy, another warning that Europe should stay within its borders. Instead, it means Jerusalem conquered, Turkish power broken, Byzantine Empire granted another generation, and Western civilization handed the breathing space to develop into the force that would eventually dominate the globe. All because a collection of rival noblemen decided that impossible odds were merely difficult, that defeat was unacceptable, and that the only way out was through. The Sultan's 250,000 warriors are dust. The 40,000 defenders of Nicaea are forgotten, but the 30,000 who refused to accept inevitable defeat, their names, Godfrey, Raymond, Bohemond, Robert, echo across centuries as testament to a single timeless truth. When leadership, courage, and tactical brilliance converge at history's pivot points, nothing is truly impossible. That's the lesson of Nicaea, not that faith alone conquers, not that Europeans were inherently superior, not that God picks sides in human conflicts, but that disciplined human beings, properly led, can achieve outcomes that every rational analysis declares impossible if they have the courage to try and the wisdom to adapt. 729 years before the world would call anything impossible odds, routine, 30,000 Crusaders showed what those words really mean. Not a guarantee of failure, but an invitation to greatness. The walls of Nicaea still stand, silent witnesses to the impossible made real.